Beer is one of the oldest drinks humans have ever made. People were brewing beer over 7,000 years ago, long before electricity, long before modern science, and even before written history in many places. But here's the surprising part. Even today, beer is still made using only 4 main ingredients. And when those 4 ingredients interact in the right way, something remarkable happens. A simple mixture of grain and water becomes a complex drink with hundreds of flavors and aromas. So how does that transformation actually happen? Today we're going to go inside the brewing process step by step to see exactly how beer is made. And by the end of this video you'll understand why brewing beer is actually a combination of chemistry, biology, and centuries of tradition. Section 1. The 4 ingredients. Every beer starts with 4 basic ingredients: water, malt, hops, and yeast. That's it. In fact, Germany even has a famous brewing rule from the year 1516 called the Reinheitsgebot, or the beer purity law, which states that beer should only contain these ingredients. But while the ingredient list looks simple, what happens during brewing is anything but simple. Each ingredient plays a very specific role. Water forms the base of the beer and makes up about 90 to 95% of the final drink. Malt, which is usually malted barley, provides the sugars that eventually become alcohol. Hops add bitterness, flavor, and aroma. And yeast is the microscopic organism that performs the most important job of all. It converts sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. But before yeast can do its work, the brewer first needs to prepare the grains. And that process begins with something called malting. Section 2. Malting. Barley doesn't naturally contain the sugars needed for fermentation. Instead, it contains starch, and yeast cannot ferment starch. So brewers first have to convert those starches into fermentable sugars. This process begins during malting. Barley grains are soaked in water and allowed to begin germinating, essentially starting the early stages of plant growth. During this process, the grain activates enzymes that are capable of breaking starch into sugar. But before the grain can fully grow into a plant, the germination process is stopped by drying the grain in a kiln. The result is malted barley, commonly called malt. The temperature used during drying has a big impact on the beer's final color and flavor. Lightly kilned malt produces pale beers like lagers and pilsners, while darker roasting creates malts used for stouts, porters, and dark ales. Now that the malt is ready, the brewer moves to the next stage: mashing. Section 3. Mashing. During mashing, crushed malt is mixed with hot water in a large vessel called a mash tun. The heat activates the enzymes created during malting. These enzymes begin breaking down the starches in the grain into simple sugars. Over the course of about 1 hour, the mixture slowly transforms. The water becomes filled with sugars, proteins, and other compounds that will eventually shape the flavor of the beer. This sugary liquid is known as wort. But before brewing can continue, the liquid must first be separated from the grain. So the brewer filters the mash, leaving behind the solid grains and collecting the sweet wort. Now the wort is ready for the next major step, and this is where beer starts to develop its bitterness. Section 4. Boiling and hops. The wort is transferred into a large brewing kettle and brought to a boil. This stage typically lasts 60 to 90 minutes. And during this boiling process, brewers add hops. Hops are the flowers of the hop plant. They contain natural compounds that provide bitterness and aroma. Why bitterness? Because without hops, beer would taste overwhelmingly sweet. The bitterness balances the sweetness of the malt and creates the flavor profile we recognize as beer. But hops do more than add bitterness. They also contribute citrus, floral, pine, tropical, and herbal aromas, depending on the hop variety. Some beers use hops sparingly. Others, like IPAs, use enormous amounts of hops to create intense flavor and aroma. By the end of boiling, the wort has been sterilized, flavored, and prepared for fermentation. But before yeast can be added, the wort must first be cooled. And once it cools down, the most important transformation begins. Section 5. Fermentation. Fermentation is where beer truly becomes beer. The cooled wort is transferred into a fermentation tank and yeast is added. Yeast is a microscopic organism that feeds on sugar. As yeast consumes the sugars in the wort, it produces two key byproducts, alcohol and carbon dioxide. This process is known as fermentation. Depending on the style of beer, fermentation can take anywhere from several days to several weeks. There are also different types of yeast. A yeast ferments at warmer temperatures and tends to produce fruity flavors. Lager yeast ferments at cooler temperatures and produces cleaner, crisper beer. During fermentation, the once sweet wort gradually transforms into something entirely different. A complex alcoholic beverage filled with flavor, but even after fermentation is complete, the beer still isn't finished, because now it needs time to mature. Section 6. Conditioning. After fermentation, beer usually undergoes a period called conditioning or lagering. During this stage, the beer rests at cold temperatures. Remaining yeast particles settle out, flavors smooth out, and carbonation stabilizes. Some beers condition for just a few weeks. Others may age for months or even years. Barrel-aged beers, for example, can mature in wooden barrels that previously held whiskey, wine, or rum. This aging process adds entirely new layers of flavor. But once conditioning is finished, the beer is finally ready for the last step. Packaging. Section 7. Packaging. Beer can be packaged in several different ways. It may be placed into bottles, cans, or kegs. Some beers are filtered for clarity. Others remain unfiltered, and in some traditional brewing methods, brewers even add a small amount of sugar before bottling. This allows yeast to perform a final miniature fermentation inside the bottle, naturally creating carbonation. Once packaged, the beer is ready to be shipped to bars, restaurants, and stores around the world. But despite modern brewing technology, the fundamental process has remained surprisingly unchanged. The same basic brewing principles have existed for thousands of years. From 4 simple ingredients, water, malt, hops, and yeast, brewers can create thousands of different beer styles, from light lagers to dark stouts, from crisp pilsners to intensely hoppy IPAs. And every one of those beers begins with the same fundamental process you just saw. But brewing beer is only the beginning. Because the world of beer includes hundreds of styles, fascinating brewing traditions, and centuries of history. And in the next video we'll explore one of the most important questions in beer: what is the difference between ale and lager? Because that single difference completely changed the history of beer.